PMRE? Split up.
Yes. We're from the West, we don't know any better. Thank you, Madam Speaker. In the status quo, we see that the United Nations has schools in Gaza, but for some reason, these schools do not teach about the Holocaust. Ali and I think that is unacceptable. So what we are going to propose is that the United Nations schools that are run in Gaza should insist on teaching the Holocaust in its curriculum. The quite likely scenario of this, there's two quite possible scenarios of this. One, Hamas allows this to happen and complies. Two, Hamas gets angry because the United Nations is teaching about the Holocaust and kicks them out. Ali and I don't think the first scenario is very contentious, but we do think the second one is. So what we're going to say is we are perfectly okay if Hamas closes down these United Nations schools for teaching the Holocaust. I hope that's fairly clear. Just to give you some background, the United Nations set up a relief works agency in Gaza. They provide refugee services, they provide humanitarian aid, and they run special schools that focus on human rights. But the issue is Hamas has given the UN this one caveat, that you can only run these schools in Gaza if you promise to never teach about the Holocaust. We think this is unacceptable. We don't think the UN should have ever bought into this. We think that we would rather see these schools closed down to have the status quo continue. Is there any points of clarification? Thank you. So, I want to talk about three things, Madam Speaker. First, I want to talk about why Holocaust education is so important, particularly in this context. Secondly, I want to talk about why omitting this one major detail from the education is tantamount to saying the Holocaust never happened, given the context that we're talking about. And thirdly, I want to talk about a couple of the practical effects on the United Nations. I will talk about some more practical effects on Hamas and make me sound better. Okay, so why do you think the Holocaust education is particularly important in this situation? So right off the bat, you have to recognize that not teaching about the Holocaust in Gaza is very contrary to the very philosophies that the United Nations were founded on, right? So the reason that we as a global society founded the United Nations is to ensure that human rights are respected and to ensure that these sorts of things never happen again. It's about reminding ourselves of atrocities and reminding other people around the world about these atrocities and how important they are. That's exactly why these schools like to focus on human rights, but it's very perverse that these schools try to focus on human rights but aren't allowed to talk about the Holocaust because Hamas won't let them, right? So we don't think that the UN is actually fulfilling its true mandate and it's actually undercutting its own philosophies when it complies with Hamas. So we don't think that it's actually being consistent philosophy in this case. But moreover, what is the actual purpose of education, right? Because we say that the identity of these children in Gaza is inextricably linked to the region's history, right? And the history of that region is linked to the Holocaust. So I don't think that you can actually inform these Gazan children about the history of their region without adequately teaching them about the Holocaust. And I think that it's not only about the identity of Israelis, but the identity of Palestinians as well is very much informed about through learning about the Holocaust. And I don't think that these kids can actually ever contextualize why they are in the conflict that they're in unless they realize that other people's rights have also been violated in the past. And we think that it's important for them to be introduced to that value, to that balance, right? So you see that this kind of reconciliation of the situation that Gazan kids find them in is quite impossible without learning about the Holocaust. We'd say that future citizens of Gaza might actually end up going to university and becoming doctors and engineers, but there's always going to be this void in their understanding of human rights because they were never taught about the Holocaust in the past. We think this is dangerous, right? And recognize that people like Mahmoud Abbas, they hold European PhDs. These aren't uneducated people, but they still advocate for Holocaust denialism because this is something that's entrenched in them from birth, right? So I think that this actually exceeds sort of the typical critical thinking that you see in schools. Was there a POI over here? Go.
When it's a part of their culture that they're exposed to all the time because it's incredibly populous, why do you think that teaching it in schools is necessarily going to change that entire social framework around the Holocaust?
Right, so this POI sounds like it's not going to be effective, so we shouldn't even try, right? So I think that it could be effective, and even if it isn't, I think that the UN should stick to its morals, right? So I think I got him on 2 levels there. So why is this tantamount to saying it doesn't exist? So we say that the United Nations would never outright lie, right? So the United Nations would never actually come out and say the Holocaust didn't happen. You'd probably get fired for doing this. But I think that given the context that Hamas has an absolute monopoly on state media, on the sort of propaganda that is perpetuated throughout Palestine, staying silent is tantamount to denialism in that sense, right? Because I think that Hamas has state media, they have children's programming, they have rallies. We think the anti-Semitism that exists within Gaza as a result of Hamas is very much intrinsic to that culture, and I think that at the point at which the UN remains silent is a point at which it becomes complicit in that and actually allows that sort of propaganda to be perpetuated. We think that's unacceptable. And we think it's particularly bad because it's the United Nations, and we think that they're the only other actor that's allowed in the region, right? So Hamas is actually okay with the UN being in the region, granted that they give them humanitarian aid, and I think this gives the United Nations a particularly powerful point of leverage because they're the only Western or only global actor outside of Hamas that are allowed into this region to have communication with these kids, right? So they're the only possible avenue of learning about an alternative view of the history of that area for these Gazan children. I think that when they stay silent, they're undercutting why they're there in the first place. Go ahead, Robbie.
How is the Holocaust relevant to the Palestinians' plight when that is entirely the result of Israel, not the apology of the Holocaust?
So the reason the Holocaust is so relevant is because we think it's important for children in Gaza to realize that human rights are kind of reciprocal, right? And I think that it's important to realize that Israeli children on the other side of the border have been profoundly affected by the Holocaust in their own history, and I think it actually helps them breed compassion, right? Because I think a lot of the problem is that Palestinian children might think that these Israeli kids are sort of entitled to this greater life, but they don't realize that in the past they also had their own human rights violated. I think it's really important to sort of breed this reciprocity and breed mutual understanding of these human rights issues. And I think that currently what Hamas says is that these Israeli kids have always lived great lives and that the Jews have always lived great lives, and as a result it makes it much more easier for them to hate them and much more easier for them to feel that Israelis aren't entitled to their own peace and their own defense. And I think that it's also important to recognize that the UN would never do something like selectively give food aid based on the whims of a dictator, right? So if Saddam Hussein said you can give food aid to Iraqis, but you can only give to Sunni Muslims, I don't think the UN would ever do that, right? And I think that this is quite analogous. This is basically like saying you can give them an education, but you can't teach them about the plight of the Jews, right? I don't think that the UN will ever compromise on its morals when it comes to humanitarian aid. I think this is an analogous scenario, and I think it's fairly wrong that they've done that so far. Lastly, I want to talk about the practical effects of the UN, right? So I think that the UN's best chance of claiming, their best claim to legitimacy is based on neutrality, right? So that's why a lot of countries that have mixed feelings about the UN allow the UN in to set up humanitarian aid camps because they see it as a somewhat neutral actor. But the point at which the UN complies with Hamas policies and stays silent on Holocaust education is the point at which it surrenders its claim to that sort of neutrality. As a result, Western countries are much more likely to be skeptical about the intentions of the UN. We see this happening throughout the General Assembly. We see that the UN is actually undermined as a neutral actor, and I think countries are less likely to engage with it, right? So I think that because Holocaust education is so important to the history and the identity of these children, and we don't think they can become good citizens without it, and because we think that staying silent is tantamount to denialism, and because we think that you completely undercut the UN's effectiveness and its philosophies by staying silent on the Holocaust, we would beg you to propose.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for his remarks. I now call forward the Leader of the Opposition. Here, Cherri.
So I like cool cases and outrounds. This is a cool case, guys. Thanks. I think this is going to be a lot of fun. So, the government's stance in this round is that silence is complicity. That if we do not stand on this matter, then we do not have anywhere to stand. On our side of the House, we say standing on our principles is useless. It gets us kicked out, and we can no longer do anything for the children and the growing adults of the Palestinian people. So the first thing that I want to talk about, as my first constructive point, is the concept of shibboleths. So what we see is that there are certain identifying characteristics that people see as particularly important, not because of any particular entity or factor of it itself, but just as a symbol. So we think that for the Palestinian people, for Hamas in particular, the Holocaust serves as a very large symbol. The Palestinians get very upset, or Hamas does, when you teach about the Holocaust, but we think that there are ways for the UN schools to teach about tolerance for Israelis that don't involve talking about the Holocaust explicitly. And the benefit there is that because it's not the Holocaust, it's not this big symbol that they treat as particularly important, the UN schools can get away with a lot of pro-Israeli or pro-equality or pro-general liberal happiness stances that they can't get away with when it's the Holocaust because it's such a loaded term.
But the best way to show Gazans that Israeli children also are entitled to their own rights is to show that once they were persecuted, and it actually breeds some sort of mutual...
Two responses. First of all, I'm pretty sure that there are no Israeli children who actually suffered during the Holocaust. Secondly, we think that there are plenty of other bad things that happen to Israeli children, plenty of other ways to indicate to the Palestinian children that Israeli children are in fact just like them. And actually, The third thing I want to point out is it's very, very difficult to educate the Palestinian children about anything if Hamas has kicked you out of the country. Which leads me right into my second point of constructive, which is other benefits of UN education. So I already mentioned that there are other avenues by which we can explore the general idea of coexistence with the Israelis that don't have the same sort of symbolic baggage as the Holocaust itself. Moreover, it's not like the Holocaust and Israel are the only topics that are ever taught in UN schools. Like, they teach other subjects. We have qualified teachers coming in, teaching, providing all sorts of education for these Palestinian children that is not available when the UN is no longer providing these school services. Like, we think that if we have to choose between having an advantage in this one area surrounding the relations with Israel and everything else that education does for a child in terms of nurturing them and turning them into a citizen, the benefits of having the UN as representatives of the rest of humanity, educating our children and telling them, helping shape their formative years, outweigh the small risks of having some people grow up and be Holocaust deniers. The third thing I want to talk about then is where exactly Hamas draws its support. So if we accept that Hamas is a group of people who often do very bad things, and we prefer them not have so much power in the region, recognize that one of the major things that causes their support is their profound support for basic social supports. So we see them running social programs, we see them running their own schools, we see them in charge of a lot of like soup kitchens and so on, things that support the Palestinian people, and they see Hamas as their ally. When the UN pulls out and is no longer filling this role as the people who provide schooling for free for these Palestinian children, then that simply strengthens Hamas's position and enables all the other things that Hamas says to have more weight because they have an even stronger place of prominence within Palestinian society. So, those are my constructive points. What do I have to say in terms of clash? So, first thing, Auyon told you that Holocaust education is important. And he specified that the thing that children in Palestinian schools learn from Holocaust education, from learning about the Holocaust, is that human rights are reciprocal. Okay. So, I'm not a formal educator, but I'm relatively certain that there are other situations you could talk about where you could indicate to people that human rights are reciprocal. You can talk about all sorts of other situations, like you can discuss the Hamas rocket attacks on Palestinian people and tell stories about these poor Israeli children who have to evacuate their schools because of rocket attacks. And that's not only likely to be at least a little bit less controversial to Hamas, but it's also much more relevant to the current status of the Palestinian or Israeli relationship. Because the Holocaust is something that happened a long time ago. It's history. It's the reason that Israel was there in the first place, but it's not specifically relevant to the conflict as it currently stands. The conflict as it currently stands is about the occupation, it's about settlements, it's about a lot of other things that don't have anything to do at all with the Holocaust. Go.
The Holocaust was the reason of the creation of Israel. I mean, the origins of Israel, the existence of Israel is irrelevant to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
Okay, so if we were talking about, if we consider this in a Canadian context then, we're talking about how we should be dealing with natives living in Canada. It's not particularly relevant to go back to European politics around the time that we were colonizing this country and see what caused us to move towards this country. That's not going to actually educate us about what the current problems are and how natives and the rest of Canada should be interacting with each other. So the fact that something was a historical reason does not necessarily mean that it's a particularly important reason right now. Second thing that Auyon talked about that I want to address is the monopoly on media, that Hamas controls the media. And we think that this makes it even more important for the UN to make sure that it can maintain its schooling here. Because we think that the education system is one of the primary means that the rest of the international community has to undermine the Hamas control of the information given to the Palestinian people. A lot of information that people get is from their education. And if Hamas is now controlling the education as well, then how else are we getting the information? This is one of the only ways we have to get past Hamas's monopoly. We don't see why we'd want to abandon it. We heard this idea that we would never give food aid at the whims of a dictator. We wouldn't let him say, don't give it to Sunnis. But if a dictator said, you can give food aid, but we demand that you never give spinach, even if we think that spinach would be really good for children, we see that there's still all sorts of other sources of iron and other essential nutrients, and it's still better for us to be giving this food aid rather than no food aid at all. If there can still do better by giving the aid than not giving the aid, then we think that the moral thing to do, the principled thing to do, is to allow Hamas to dictate some of the terms of our education rather than eliminating that education entirely. For these reasons, we're proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the Leader of the Opposition for his remarks. I now call forward the Minister of the Crown.
So Iain practically conceded half our case. He said, the UN shouldn't care about morals, it doesn't matter, let's forget principles. So he basically conceded that the UN should be complicit in lies, that the UN should forgo neutrality. And I think by conceding half of the arguments that Auyon talked about, he significantly deteriorates the quality of the round, but more importantly, misses the entire mandate of the actual UN, right? Which is in part to be principled, right? I don't think the UN Charter of Rights is really one of practicalities. It's ones of dignity. What do people deserve? What should we give them? I think it's very much the essence of the United Nations, and to kind of dismiss that was a real harm to their side. But first, let's talk about the Holocaust. So I want to refute their arguments and rebuild ours. Because one thing I want to mention is I really like how Iain kept talking about the Holocaust, right? As if the Holocaust is something you can just dismiss by kind of elevating your tone. The Holocaust is a significant event in history. It's unique, it's particular, and there are reasons why we should continue to teach it in Gaza. Let's give you those reasons. So first of all, what they talk about is the Holocaust serves as a symbol that Hamas is not comfortable with. So first of all, what he's saying here is that it's easier, ladies and gentlemen, to not use the Holocaust, not to have a Holocaust within Gaza for Hamas. So I question whether we should actually care about what's easier for Hamas. But more importantly, this isn't about Holocaust as a symbol. It's about Holocaust as truth. Holocaust as objectivity, right? Because we don't contend that the UN should teach the Holocaust in a very particular biased way. We say, give the facts, show the pictures of Auschwitz, show the footage that we have, but Hamas is completely free to use that symbol however which way they wish. But here's the thing, Hamas is afraid of the Holocaust symbol because they recognize the power of the Holocaust as truth and objectivity that tells us and channels us the suffering and pain of the Jews that they suffered 60 years ago is going to penetrate the souls of Palestinians within Gaza. That's ultimately what they are afraid of, and we don't think that should be a concern of ours. But more fundamentally, we think that the Holocaust could be used as a symbol to actually talk about the injustices against the Palestinians, right? The fact that a lot of these racist laws that existed within Germany, such as forcing people to have identification based on race, you can create a lot of analogies when we think of Hamas, which is great at spinning propaganda. They can do that, right? So if you want to make that concession, you can keep that in your house. But ultimately, we think that truth should go through to the Palestinians. Secondly, he talks about how you can teach them about other things, right? So a couple of things here. One is this, right? So we don't think that other things demonstrate the Holocaust is relevant, right? So I don't think them learning about the genocide in Rwanda is going to be particularly relevant to those in Gaza. They'll learn some principles of it, but how it directly affects their relationship with those who are counter to them within Israel, within Palestine, such as the Jews, right? Which is the most defining relationship for these people's lives. I think that's really important. It tells you how it allows these individuals, such as Gaza and children, to actually have compassion for these individuals as a way of actually undermining this idea of having hatred for them, because it seems like they've always had superior position and superior resources, and they're just evil and they're picking on us, right? It demonstrates something completely different. But more importantly, what if you accept, here's the thing, right? What's to say that Hamas won't make other conditions? You've already conceded the Holocaust is not being very important. Can the Hamas then are you giving them the leverage then to say, let's take the Arab-Israel war out of the history, right? You're allowing them to change just about anything in the curriculum, because if we accept their philosophy as being consistent, it is this. If Hamas makes a concession to ask us to give up certain things for political goals, we will do it and undermine the quality of education as a result, undermine the quality of truth. And I think that's not something we can stand for broadly.
lobby. Okay, so if Hamas says that they are not allowed to teach anything in their schools, we teach it anyways and then they kick us out, it still doesn't get taught in Hamas schools.
Okay, right? I don't understand actually why. So, let's go to power in the region. Power in the region. So first of all, he talks about like how Palestinians, like Hamas, will be strengthened if we actually pull out. So a couple of things here. One, you weaken Hamas, right? I don't think you strengthen Hamas. It's not as if Hamas has infinite resources, and the UN is providing them a service. So they're going to have to spend money on their schools. They're going to have to provide infrastructure, and maybe they'll start spending less money on rockets and more money in schools as a result. So this actually hurts Hamas. But more fundamentally, let's talk about demographics, because I realize in Gaza there are a lot of hardline Hamas supporters, but I think the majority of people aren't dogmatically aligned with Hamas. And if you're known as the administration that lost us to really legitimate and good schools, such as the United Nations one, I think that weakens Hamas. The question we have to ask ourselves today, are we obligated to stand and give money and resources to a stance which is contrary to our mandate? I don't think we're obligated to, and I think in fact it's important that we do. I think I understand your appeal. I'm going to answer in a second. Couple more things, right? So first of all, we talked about the Holocaust education being really important. So they dismiss a lot of things that Auyon says. He talks about how we're not fulfilling our mandate to teaching human rights. And what Iain says is first of all, the Holocaust isn't that important. I've already addressed that. But he also talks about we don't have to learn so much about history. Look at the natives, right? They don't have to learn about European colonial policies because that doesn't affect natives. Are you kidding me? All the things that we did, give them blankets for smallpox, put them in residential schools, all of these things contributed to the position of natives. This does a couple of things. One, it teaches us what exactly the origins of this, but more importantly, it allows these individuals, natives, or in this instance, Gazans, to understand why they are where they are, and we think we owe it to them to teach to them as a mandate of education. More importantly, the UN would never lie. The UN would never break certain principles, such as giving food to certain people. So so what they say is look, you can forego spinach and give them other food. They can get other things. So let me clarify this analogy. I think really the best version of this argument is the fact this. You give them an education, they'll grow up to be critical thinkers, they'll probably be able to question Hamas. We don't think that is true, right? We think they're going to grow up because the Holocaust denial, because of the context we talk about, the anti-Semitism and the propaganda, from an age of birth they're taught this, it occupies a different realm for them, right? It is no longer a realm of knowledge that can be critically verified. It is something you simply believe in because it premised on this idea that Western nations will lie and fabricate evidence. So we think we lose these individuals. The UN is in a unique position because of its respect by the Gaza people to actually question everything and not reconfirm. Ladies and gentlemen, if Saddam Hussein told us only give food to the Sunnis, we wouldn't oblige, even though we will feed more people, because it undermines our principles. Principles are important. That's why we have it.
I'd like to thank the Minister of the Crown for his remarks. I now call forth the Member of Opposition.
So I want to get the Saddam Hussein example out of the way right now. The difference between Saddam Hussein saying that we can't educate Shias in Sunni Iraq is much different than saying that we can't teach one thing in the curriculum. We think that it's very different from limiting the service that we provide to everyone versus limiting our ability to provide the service to everyone. We are educating children in Gaza. Hamas is not telling us that we can't educate certain individuals within Gaza. So we are providing everyone a benefit. The difference is that they're going to put contingencies on it to allow us to operate within that country and provide the most education possible. What we are looking at here is a case about education. Do curriculums have to be unlimited? And is the Holocaust a relevant thing to be putting into the Gazan curriculum? We would say no, especially when it threatens our ability to have that curriculum taught at all in the first place. So, Ali came up here first and said that we admitted to forgetting our principles. But we think that it is impossible to say that your moral actions are entirely dependent on your intentions. That because your intentions are good, the outcomes must necessarily be good. We think that if your intention is good, but your outcome results in no Gazan children getting education, you have failed as a moral actor. You have failed to provide education to the citizens of this country and the citizens of the world when you allow them to go without it, because you were refusing to modify the curriculum to fulfill your principles. We think that it is okay to sometimes allow limitations, and the spinach example is perfect here. Sometimes dictators aren't going to allow you to do whatever you want, but the reality is that they hold the power to throw you out of their country instantaneously if you decide to cross them. And as a result of that, the best way to provide services is to set a reasonable limit and say, these are things which we will not abide. We will not abide selective services. We will not abide discriminatory services. But we're okay with providing lesser services. We're okay with providing less as long as we are providing something to everyone. We think that that is a reasonable standard for the United Nations to hold. We think that that is a moral action. Then he talks about like the Holocaust. We point out that curriculums are limited. We can't teach every truth all the time. So it's better to talk about the more relevant truths. I'm going to get into that in my constructive. And when he talks about this idea of penetrating into the souls of Palestinian children, it's simply not true. Because there are actually a lot of parallels with the Holocaust that aren't going to lead to Palestinian children thinking, wow, we should forgive the Israelis for all of these horrific crimes that they're committing against us right now. He also talked about this idea of the UN providing a service. But we don't necessarily weaken Hamas if they don't have education, because they can put in more madrasas. Or realistically, they're still strong men. They still rely on guns to hold on to control, even if they get some popular support from holding services. They intimidated out all of their rivals. They prevented anyone else from taking political control of Gaza by assassinating people. They are not just popular men trying to get votes in the Gazan elections. They are thugs and terrorists.
Stop lying. Hamas was elected legitimately. It was called by international observers. So stop trying to say they're simply strong men. They do.
So when Fatah officials are being thrown off balconies with bullets through their brains, we don't consider that a legitimate election. We don't consider Hamas's constant use of force against their own civilians to be a legitimate form. We also don't consider the fact that they employ most young Gazan men to hold guns and enforce that same rule of order as a legitimate democratic government. This is simply a falsehood. They also talked about this example that Iain brought up, that we wouldn't tell people, we wouldn't teach natives about Spanish policies when they launched Christopher Columbus's boat. Because it's not relevant how the white man got to America. What's relevant is what they did when they got there. And that's the important part of this case, is that yes, the Israelis went to Israel, or the Jews went to Israel in large part because of the Holocaust, in large part also because of the homeland that was promised to them in the Torah, or in their religious scriptures. There are other reasons as well that they went there. But even so, that doesn't apologize for the actions that they committed once they got there. That is what's relevant. That's what you should be teaching these Israeli children, or these Palestinian children, is what is relevant to your historical context. And I've already talked about the spinach example and why that's actually true. So I want to get into some constructive about the nature of neutrality. Because we think that the nature of neutrality is not maintaining some kind of weird, secular, perfect view of how the world should operate. The definition of neutrality is not enforcing your beliefs on other people when you're trying to help them. And we think that when the United Nations says that we will not help you unless you allow us to enforce our values onto you, we're not being neutral. We're being colonialist. We're being the Western thinkers enforcing our beliefs on the Palestinian children. We are violating the United Nations' commitment to neutrality by forcing governments to teach certain things. That's why the UN rarely creates binding resolutions. Because we realize that we want to create a neutral, positive forum for people to talk to each other. Not somewhere where Western imperial ideas can be forced down the throats of other nations that depend upon our aid to provide services to their citizens. I also want to get into why the Holocaust and modern Israel are highly relevant to each other, but that the Holocaust does not apologize for or explain Israeli actions towards the Palestinians. Because if you look at the wrong that was done, the fact that wrong was done to the Israelis, sure. But that doesn't justify the Israelis committing wrongful acts against the Palestinians. We don't think that it's realistically going to warm the hearts and souls of the Palestinian children to hear about how Israel is acting eye for an eye. Because frankly, if that's the historical lesson that you're teaching them, what are the Palestinian children going to take away from it? Well, the Israelis have been oppressing us for 50 years. They've taken away our rights to mobility. They've shoved us into situations which are absolutely horrific. They've blockaded us. They've waged war against us, and they've massacred us. And their justification for doing so is because someone else did it to them. So what's the reasonable justification that says that I can't do it to them? We don't think that the Holocaust promotes this universal vision that no one should ever commit harm against each other when it's taught as a apology for Israeli actions, when the reason why you want to bring it in is to stem compassion, to teach Palestinian children about the suffering of Israeli ancestors, it means that the Palestinian children are going to think about this and say, well, if you have suffered so horribly and you understand what it means to be oppressed, if you understand what it means to be murdered in the streets, why are you doing it to us? What makes us so different from you? And it doesn't breed compassion, it breeds anger. It makes them ask, why, as someone who's been historically oppressed, are you now oppressing us? It doesn't teach them the lesson that you're trying to promote of universal peace and harmony and human rights. What it promotes is apology, saying that violence has been committed against us, therefore violence is justified. And frankly, that's exactly what Hamas wants to hear. We would maybe prefer them being denialist and silly and then be able to tell them they're being silly than allow them to teach apology, which is what they're asking us to do.
I'd like to thank the member of opposition for his remarks. I now call forth the leader of the opposition to summarize opposition.
Three questions. First question, is the Holocaust important? We say on-side opposition, sure, it's pretty important, but it's not so important that a curriculum without it is worthless. Recognize that the Holocaust is history. Now it's really, really, really sad history, and we think it's particularly terrible, but it's not Palestinian history. It's not directly related to this conflict. It's a distant cause of what's currently going on, much as the internal politics of Spain pre-Christopher Columbus caused what's happening in Canada, but aren't particularly relevant to anything. What we think is much better is talking about Israel today. If you really want Palestinian school children to have sympathy for Israelis, talk about the rocket attacks. Talk about the kidnappings in Munich. Talk about ways that Israelis and Jews are currently being prosecuted, because we think that those are much more relevant. One way that we think the Holocaust is important is that it's important to Hamas as a symbol. Not because of the events themselves, not because of anything surrounding the tragic things that took place in Germany, but simply because the Holocaust serves as a symbol, and opposition to the Holocaust is something that Hamas can rally around. We think it's perfectly fine to set that aside in search of a greater good. Second question, what happens when we get kicked out? We say Hamas takes over schooling. Hamas reinforces its stranglehold on information. Hamas builds up its position as the chief ruler of the Palestinian people. Palestinian school children lose every other aspect of the UN curriculum. Every other place where the UN educators can subtly undermine Hamas is now vanished because we decided to stand on this one principle. We lose our ability to teach tolerance in other ways, and we think that's problematic. So what we have to ask ourselves here is, what exactly is the principled stance? Because we heard in the second speech outside government this contention that we'd just given up on principles, that we didn't think the UN should be principled, that we didn't think that there was any pretense towards neutrality in the UN. And we think that's false. We think that if standing on your principles leads to awful outcomes, leads to all the terrible things that I think we've proven fairly conclusively on our side of the house, then maybe your principles suck. We have principles on our side too. We say that children deserve education. We say that malevolent regimes with a monopoly on information deserve to be undermined. We think that the real important question in this round is not, can you stand on principles, but what happens when your principles collide? How do you deal with a bunch of principles telling you to do different things? And we think fundamentally, if you want to be a responsible, principled actor in the world, you have to compromise on some principles to protect others. On our side of the house, we are willing to do that. On our side of the house, we are willing to let Hamas have its one symbolic victory because we think we can do more good in the Palestinian school system than outside of it. For these reasons, we are very proud of Hamas.
I'd like to thank the leader of the opposition for his remarks. I now call for the Prime Minister to close out the debate.
So I think we get some pretty interesting concessions in this round from Iain and Robbie. I think very early on in the debate they said it's perfectly okay to skirt sort of like your moral legitimacy of certain things if you can achieve humanitarian aid on the ground. I think Ali and I gave you a number of examples of why the UN doesn't do that already. I think we're more philosophically consistent with respect to how the UN operates in the world. I don't think they gave us a good vision for that, right? But I think that you actually have to need to draw the line somewhere, and I don't think Iain and Robbie really responded to Ali's claim that what if Hamas now says you have to take the Arab-Israeli war out? What if Hamas now says you have to take another facet of that history out, right? Would you then concede that as well, just because education is better than no education, right? So I don't think Iain and Robbie really tell us where they would draw the line. Ali and I would say, every day when we deal with these sorts of regimes, we need to draw the line somewhere. I think we're at least being consistent in saying that no education is better than an education that only reaffirms Holocaust denialism. Right? Also, from Iain and Robbie, we get this idea about neutrality that they kind of perverted from our side. So first of all, they don't respond to any of the analysis we gave you about how Western nations won't really see the UN as being neutral anymore. But more interestingly, they tell us that the Holocaust is a political issue and it should comply with the local version of that history to be neutral. The idea that the Holocaust is a political issue is like the most heinous thing ever, right? The whole point of this case is the Holocaust is objective, the Holocaust is truth, and at the point at which Iain and Robbie can see that it's a political issue is the point at which they say that it's completely okay with aligning itself with Hamas dogma, right? It's not a political issue, it is true. Secondly, what about education? So they also tell us at the beginning of the round that the creation of Israel is not relevant to the identity and the history of these children. That is like hogwash. I think Ali dealt with that. But moreover, I think we should let Palestinian children decide for themselves what they believe, right? Because just because UN schools teach about Holocaust doesn't mean Hamas is going to stop denying it, right? So at least in our side of the house, yes, you have the denialism of the Hamas state, but then you also have UN teachers trying to counter that with an alternate vision. If they really want Gazans to sort of form their own critical thinking and minds through education, then they should allow at least two alternate views to exist. On their side of the house, they allow this sort of monopoly to exist within Hamas. And I think that we're not necessarily going to warm their hearts, but I think that compassion towards Israeli is impossible without tissue of the past. So they also skirt the relevance of the Holocaust, right? So they say that the Holocaust happened 60 years ago, guys. It doesn't matter anymore. The Holocaust might have happened 60 years ago, but Holocaust denialism is happening today. And that's exactly what's relevant in this case. I think they fail to understand that. Lastly, Madam Speaker, I want to talk about the future of Gaza, right? Because I'm going to say that a technical education about math, engineering, how to be a doctor is all useless with respect to the Palestinian and Israeli conflict, right? Because Gazans gaining these skills and being able to count and having these sorts of basic educations, learning how to read, all of that is useless because their plight will continue indefinitely in the status quo unless they learn to appreciate sort of the rights that other people have in the region, right? So I think that we're perfectly okay with them not having these sorts of educations because it's just going to perpetuate the status quo where Hamas has a monopoly and there's no way to come to any sort of meaningful conflict resolution unless you breed compassion on both sides. We offer you that on-site proposition. We thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for his remarks. I call the